As a researcher, I'm actually really excited to be here, and one of the reasons why I'm here is to figure out how I can incorporate video games and video game design into my research. And I think from my end, I think what I have to contribute is the understanding of how people learn and some of the basics of how people learn. So today what I'm gonna talk about how uncertainty is influencing learning. So video game designers are acutely aware of uncertainty. So sometimes designers use uncertainty to increase and make the gameplay experience more positive. So in the Brookhaven experiment, for example, you have to figure out when and where zombies are coming to kill you, and all you have is a little flashlight to figure out where they're coming from. And in the Binding of Isaac, for example, they use uncertainty to make the gameplay more replayable by every time that you respawn, the gameplay is randomized. And they also try to reduce uncertainty. So, for example, at the beginning of most games, you have some sort of tutorial to reduce the uncertainty of how to actually interact with the game. But today I want to present a different lens on uncertainty, about how some researchers think about and study uncertainty. And the kind of uncertainty I'm going to talk about falls into two categories: expected and unexpected uncertainty. So expected uncertainty is the sort of constant probability structure that people learn to expect. So for example, in a Call of Duty game, that when you start a map, you learn that there's certain probabilities of locations that you're going to spawn at. And those are consistent throughout the entire game. And so once you can learn to expect those, you can make a strategy that works accordingly to those locations. But again, it's a consistent but random probability structure that you can learn. Whereas with unexpected uncertainty, the idea is that the environment has changed enough that everything you learned about the probabilities before doesn't apply anymore, and you need to relearn everything. So for example, if you go to a completely new game map, the spawn points that you had previously learned just don't apply anymore, and you need to relearn all those things. So the point is that uncertainty in these contexts are acting as a learning signal to show that everything you learned before and things that you learned before don't fit anymore about your predictions about how the world is going to work, so you need to change and adapt your behavior. So we were interested in using this to see how it influenced learning. And the way that we studied this is with a rule switching paradigm. So in this paradigm, you are categorizing colored shapes. Sometimes you categorize them by the shape, so a square or a circle. And then you'll get a rule switch, and then you have to ignore the shape, and then you have to focus on the color, blue or green. And what's convenient about this paradigm is that the way we can manipulate uncertainty here is we can manipulate when the rule switch is going to happen. So the way that we are manipulating uncertainty in this study is in two ways. So the first way is either probabilistic or deterministic switches. So in probabilistic switches, you have for example, you have a 30% switch probability. Whereas in deterministic, it's predictable. It'll happen every 3 times. And the other way we're manipulating it is manipulating unexpected or expected uncertainty. So in unexpected uncertainty, in our training blocks, that the probability structure is going to change from training block to training block. So first you have a switch every 3 trials, and then the next training block it's a switch every 5 trials, and the next training block is a switch every 2 trials. So the idea is that people are learning the probability structure in one training block, and then we switch it up on them, and they have to relearn a new probability structure. Whereas in expected uncertainty, it's going to just be a constant probability structure the entire time. So there's nothing new to learn. And so the two things that we're really interested in here was looking at what effect there is on learning and whether there's some individual differences in how people deal with uncertainty. So first, looking at learning, the way that we are defining learning in this context is a change from the beginning to end of training based on switch cost. So switch cost is just defined as how well you do when you have to switch. So it's harder to change rule dimensions. You have to shift your attention. It takes longer. It's more difficult. So the faster you are at being able to do that, the more you've learned. And so in this graph, the higher you are up, the more you've learned from the beginning to end. And we find here that this little blue one is the completely certain condition. When you compare it to actually any of the other conditions with any amount of uncertainty in it, people are actually learning more when you've introduced uncertainty. And then just looking at some of the individual differences. So here we are actually taking measures of schizotypy. So schizotypy is just behaviors that are related to schizophrenia. It's not a diagnosed schizophrenia, but just behaviors related to it. And the reason why we're looking at this is that there's some research that suggests that people with schizotypy have issues learning in uncertain contexts. So the way that we decided to look at this was we looked at changes from, we averaged across all the training blocks, and we looked at the changes from the beginning to the end of training blocks to see how people adapted when they had an uncertain, when they had uncertainty introduced. So when we looked at, again, when we looked at the control condition, the one where there's no uncertainty, there's no difference in people who had high schizotypy in the green and low schizotypy in the purple. But when looking at any of the other uncertainty conditions, there was a difference in that the people in the high schizotypy condition were actually slower at the beginning, but then they could adapt, whereas the people in low schizotypy didn't have this. So what we take this to mean is that people who are high schizotypy are actually hurt when there is uncertainty, and then actually over the course of training, they don't learn to expect that things are going to change all the time. Whereas people with low schizotypy were. So just in conclusion, that results suggest that you can use uncertainty as a tool for teaching. And here, we only looked at a very specific kind of uncertainty, in that uncertainty of when things are going to happen. But there's different kinds of uncertainty that probably matter to different kinds of training paradigms. And I think what this then suggests is that that you might want to be able to track uncertainty and figure out when people are actually certain. And if you can figure out when they are certain, then you can actually, at that point, then introduce uncertainty to try to push people to keep learning, get them to adapt their behavior. And then finally, what the individual differences really suggests that that with games that have uncertainty as a big component of it, which many games do, that because people respond differently to uncertainty, that you're probably going to want to take that into account and treat those people differently. Thank you.